Picture this. You're dangling from a cliff, 200 feet above jagged rocks, your fingers bleeding as they desperately claw at stone. Your husband stands above you, watching you die. But here's the twist that'll blow your mind. He's not trying to save you. He's making sure you fall. Sarah Mitchell thought she had the perfect marriage, a successful husband, a beautiful home, and finally, after 3 years of trying, they were working on their relationship during a romantic mountain getaway. What she didn't know was that her loving husband had already spent her life insurance money in his head. What she didn't know was that his assistant was pregnant with his child. And what she definitely didn't know was that this wasn't a reconciliation trip. It was her execution. But sometimes the universe has other plans. Sometimes a billionaire in a helicopter appears at exactly the right moment. And sometimes the woman you tried to erase from existence comes back stronger, smarter, and absolutely determined to destroy you. This is the story of how a pregnant wife's worst nightmare became her greatest transformation, how betrayal became power, how a woman legally declared dead returned to serve justice at her own husband's engagement party. You think you know how this story ends? Trust me, you don't. The wind howled through the canyon as Sarah Mitchell dangled from the rocky ledge, her fingers bleeding as they clawed desperately at the jagged stone. Her pregnant belly pressed against the cliff face, while her husband Brad stood 30 feet above, his silhouette dark against the morning sky. The sound of her own screaming echoed off the canyon walls, but no help was coming. Not from the man who had promised to love and protect her forever. "Brad, please," she screamed, her voice breaking with desperation and disbelief. "Help me. I'm carrying your child." But Brad didn't move. He simply stared down at her with cold, calculating eyes that she no longer recognized. The man she had married, the man she had trusted with her whole heart and soul, watched her struggle for her life with the detached interest of someone observing an ant drowning in a puddle. There was no panic in his expression, no frantic attempts at rescue, no desperate calls for help, only satisfaction. "The baby was never part of my plan," Brad called down, his voice carrying easily in the mountain air, with a casual cruelty that made her blood freeze. "Neither were you, Sarah. Not anymore." Her grip was slipping with each passing second. Each moment felt like an eternity as gravity pulled at her exhausted body with relentless determination. Below her, the canyon floor weighted 200 feet down, nothing but rocks and certain death. Above her, the man she loved was letting her die with the same cold efficiency he brought to his business deals. But this nightmare had begun 48 hours earlier, in the safety of their suburban home, when Sarah had discovered the pregnancy test hidden in their bathroom drawer. Not hers, someone else's, someone who had been in her house, in her most private space, taking a test that would change everything about her world. The morning sun had streamed through their bedroom window as Sarah sat on their perfectly made bed, staring at the plastic stick in her trembling hands. Positive. The word blazed at her like an accusation. Someone else was pregnant, and that someone had been intimate enough with her husband to use their private bathroom, comfortable enough to leave evidence of her condition where Sarah might find it. The discovery felt like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs and leaving her gasping for breath in a room that suddenly felt too small and too warm. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell had always prided herself on being perceptive, on reading situations and people with an accuracy that had served her well in her marketing career. But love had made her blind to the signs that her marriage was not just failing, but had been built on a foundation of lies from the very beginning. For months, she had ignored the warning signs that her marriage was crumbling beneath her feet. The late nights at the office that stretched into early morning hours, always with some urgent deadline or client emergency that couldn't wait. The way Brad's shirts carried the scent of unfamiliar perfume that was definitely not the fragrance he had given her for their anniversary. The hushed phone calls that ended abruptly the moment she entered the room, followed by Brad's explanation that it was just business, nothing she needed to worry her pretty head about. She had blamed his increasingly distant behavior on work stress, on the pressure of building his tech company from a startup into a major player in the industry. She had made excuses for his cold touches, his distracted kisses, his inability to maintain eye contact during their increasingly rare conversations. She had convinced herself that his emotional withdrawal was temporary, that once the business stabilized, once the latest crisis passed, Once they finally got pregnant and started the family they had planned, everything would return to the way it had been in the beginning. But the pregnancy test in her hands told a different story entirely. Her husband was having an affair, and his mistress was pregnant with the child that Sarah had been trying desperately to give him for 3 long, heartbreaking years. The irony was devastating and complete. Sarah had spent countless nights crying herself to sleep, wondering why her body wouldn't cooperate, why she couldn't give Brad the family he claimed to want so desperately. She had endured fertility treatments that left her bloated and emotional, hormone injections that made her feel like a stranger in her own skin, and the monthly heartbreak of negative pregnancy tests that felt like personal failures. Meanwhile, Brad had been creating life with someone else. Sarah. Brad's voice had drifted up from downstairs, warm and familiar, and now utterly false. "Everything okay up there? You've been quiet this morning." She had quickly hidden the test in her purse, her mind racing through possibilities and explanations, desperately hoping there was some innocent reason for its presence in their bathroom. Maybe it belonged to her sister who had visited last month and stayed overnight. Maybe Brad had picked it up by mistake at the pharmacy when he was getting her vitamins. Maybe there was some explanation that didn't involve the complete destruction of everything she believed about her life. But even as she grasped for alternative explanations, like a drowning woman reaching for driftwood, Sarah knew the truth with a certainty that made her stomach turn. The perfume on his shirts wasn't a mistake. The restaurant receipts for expensive dinners at places they had never been together weren't accidents. The way he had been pulling away from her physically and emotionally wasn't temporary stress that would resolve itself once business improved. Her husband was betraying her in the most fundamental way possible, and she had been too trusting, too naive, too desperately in love to see it until the evidence was literally in her hands. When Brad appeared in their doorway moments later, Sarah forced herself to look at him with new eyes, as if seeing him for the first time. He was still handsome at 32, with the kind of boyish charm and easy confidence that had first attracted her 6 years ago when they met at a technology conference in San Francisco. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, his expensive suit tailored to showcase his athletic build, his smile warm and practiced and completely false. Everything about him seemed calculated now, as if she was finally seeing past the carefully constructed facade to the manipulator beneath. How had she missed it for so long? How had she been so blind to the performance he had been giving her for years? "Just getting ready for work," she had said, proud of how steady her voice sounded, despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. Brad had crossed the room with the easy grace that had once made her heart flutter, kissing her forehead with the same gentle affection he showed her every morning. But now it felt like betrayal pressed against her skin, a mockery of the intimacy they had once shared. "I love you," he had whispered against her hair. The words that had once made her feel like the luckiest woman in the world now sounding hollow and rehearsed. "I love you too," she had whispered back, already mourning the death of those words and everything they had once meant. The confrontation had been everything Sarah feared and nothing like she expected. She had spent the entire day at her part-time consulting job, her mind spinning with possible scenarios and explanations. Her hands shaking every time she touched the pregnancy test hidden in her desk drawer, like a piece of evidence in a crime she was still trying to understand. By evening, she had convinced herself that there had to be some reasonable explanation, some misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a simple conversation between two adults who loved each other. Maybe the test belonged to Elena Torres, Brad's assistant, who had been feeling under the weather lately. Maybe she had used their bathroom during the company party they had hosted last month and forgotten the test there. Maybe there was some innocent explanation that would allow Sarah to continue believing in her marriage and her future. But Brad hadn't denied the affair when she placed the pregnancy test on their coffee table that night, setting it down between their 2 cups of cooling tea like a bomb waiting to explode. He hadn't shown surprise or confusion or any of the emotions she had been expecting from an innocent man confronted with false accusations. Instead, he had looked at the plastic stick with mild annoyance, as if Sarah had discovered something inconvenient but not particularly important or surprising. "How long?" Sarah's voice had been steadier than she felt, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking visibly. Her entire world was collapsing around her, but some stubborn part of her refused to let Brad see her break completely. Does it matter? Brad had shrugged with casual indifference, settling back into his leather chair with the confidence of a man who had been caught but wasn't particularly concerned about the consequences. He looked completely at ease, as if they were discussing the weather rather than the destruction of their marriage. It matters to me. The words came out stronger than Sarah felt, surprising her with their force. She had spent years accommodating Brad's moods, making excuses for his behavior, and smoothing over the rough edges of their relationship to keep the peace. But this betrayal was too massive to ignore or rationalize away. 6 months. Brad had examined his manicured fingernails with more interest than he showed his wife's pain, his tone conversational and matter-of-fact. Maybe 7. Time flies when you're having fun. Elena's good at her job, Sarah. All aspects of it. Elena Torres. Sarah's mind immediately conjured an image of Brad's assistant, a beautiful young woman with dark hair, knowing eyes, and the kind of sophisticated confidence that came from growing up in the city. She was 26 to Sarah's 28, ambitious and sharp and everything Sarah had once been before she gave up her career to focus on their marriage and the family they were supposedly building together. Elena had seemed so competent, so dedicated to her work, always staying late to help Brad with important projects and traveling with him to business conferences where Sarah wasn't welcome, because wives would be a distraction. Now Sarah understood exactly what that dedication entailed and why wives weren't invited to witness it. The casual cruelty in Brad's voice had stolen Sarah's breath and left her reeling. This wasn't the man who had proposed to her in Central Park 3 years ago, getting down on one knee in the snow while tourists took pictures and applauded. This wasn't the man who had cried when she miscarried 8 months into their marriage, holding her while she sobbed and promising that they would try again when she was ready. This wasn't the man who had held her through endless nights of grief and disappointment when month after month produced negative pregnancy tests and another cycle of hope, followed by devastating disappointment. Or maybe it was exactly who he had always been, and she had been too blind with love and hope to see the predator hiding behind the romantic gestures and sweet words. "I want you to leave," Sarah had said, surprised by the strength in her own voice and the clarity of her decision. "Pack your things and get out. Tonight." Brad had laughed then, a sound devoid of humor that made Sarah's skin crawl and her stomach turn. The laughter went on too long, echoing in their living room like the sound of something precious breaking beyond repair. "Leave? Sarah, sweetheart, I think you're confused about how this works." His tone was patronizing, the way someone might speak to a child who had said something amusing but foolish. "I think you've misunderstood the nature of our relationship and your position in it." "What do you mean?" "I mean this house is in both our names, which makes it legally mine as much as yours. My business accounts are joint accounts, which means your money is my money. Your inheritance from your grandmother is legally mine as much as yours according to the marriage contract you signed." Brad had leaned forward, his eyes glittering with something Sarah had never seen before. Something predatory and calculating that made her feel like prey caught in a trap she hadn't even known existed. The words hit Sarah like a series of physical blows, each one designed for maximum impact and damage. Her grandmother's inheritance had been $2.5 million, money that had funded Brad's business ventures and their comfortable lifestyle. Money that Sarah had given freely and without reservation because she loved him and believed in their future together and wanted to be a supportive wife. "Then I'll leave," she had said, the words coming out before she could stop them. But once spoken, they felt right and necessary and like the only way to preserve what was left of her dignity. She couldn't stay in this house, in this marriage, with this stranger wearing her husband's face and speaking with his voice. With what money? Brad's smile had turned sharp and predatory, revealing teeth that suddenly looked dangerous. "You quit your job when we got married, remember? You wanted to focus on starting a family, on being the perfect wife and eventual mother, so noble, so trusting, so completely dependent on me for everything." The word trusting had dripped with contempt and mockery, and Sarah had finally understood the full scope of her situation with a clarity that was both illuminating and terrifying. This wasn't a marriage that had failed due to circumstances or misunderstandings, or the natural drift that sometimes happens between couples. This was a trap that had finally sprung, a carefully constructed prison that she had walked into willingly with her eyes wide open and her heart full of love. Brad had isolated her systematically over the course of their 3-year marriage, each step so small and reasonable that she hadn't noticed the cage being built around her until it was too late to escape. He had convinced her to quit her successful marketing job, telling her that his business was successful enough to support them both and that her energy would be better spent on creating the family they both wanted. He had encouraged her to rely on him for all financial decisions, praising her for being above the mundane concerns of money management and allowing him to handle all the boring details of their life together. Every choice that had seemed loving and protective at the time now revealed itself as another bar in the cage he had built around her, with patience and skill. "You planned this," she had whispered, the full scope of his betrayal finally becoming clear. "All of it. The marriage, the isolation, everything." "I planned to be happy," Brad had replied, standing and straightening his tie with the same casual efficiency he brought to everything in his life. "You were supposed to be temporary, Sarah, a stepping stone to something better, but you proved more useful than I expected, so I kept you around longer than originally planned." "Useful how?" "Your grandmother's money funded my business when the banks wouldn't give me loans. Your connections in the marketing world opened doors that would have taken me years to open on my own. Your trust made everything so easy, so smooth, so much simpler than it would have been with someone more suspicious or experienced." Brad had checked his phone, already dismissing her as if she were an employee he had just fired and no longer needed to consider. "Elena understands what I need from a partner. She's ambitious, focused on the future, rather than dwelling on domestic fantasies and unrealistic expectations about love and family." "What about the baby you wanted? The family we were building together?" "Elena's pregnant. I'm getting my family. Just not with you." The words had hit Sarah like physical blows, each one designed to cause maximum damage to her already shattered sense of reality. Everything she had believed about her life, her marriage, her future, crumbled in that moment like a house of cards in a strong wind. She was 28 years old, unemployed by choice, emotionally destroyed, and legally tied to a man who saw her as nothing more than a financial convenience and source of funding for his real life with another woman. "I could divorce you," she had said weakly, grasping for any weapon in a fight she was already losing and didn't understand how to win. "You could try." Brad had gathered his car keys and wallet, preparing to leave her alone with the wreckage of everything she had believed about her life. "But divorce is expensive, Sarah. Lawyers are expensive. Fighting me in court's expensive. And you don't have any money that isn't also mine, any assets that I don't have equal claim to, any resources that I can't tie up in legal proceedings for years." He had started toward the door, then paused with his hand on the doorframe. "Elena and I are going away for the weekend. Some mountain resort she's been wanting to try. Don't wait up." After he left, Sarah had sat alone in their living room until dawn, staring at the pregnancy test that represented another woman's future, while her own world collapsed around her in slow motion. She had thought about calling someone for help or support, but Brad had been right about her isolation. Her friends had drifted away during the marriage as she became more focused on domestic life and less available for the social activities that had once been important to her. Her parents lived across the country and barely called anymore, having been gradually convinced by Brad that their frequent contact was unhealthy and preventing Sarah from fully committing to her new life as a wife. By morning, Sarah had made a decision. She wouldn't let Brad win completely. She would find a way to reclaim her life, even if it meant starting over with nothing and rebuilding everything from scratch. She was young, intelligent, and capable, and she refused to let one man's betrayal destroy her completely. But Brad had one more move to make, and it would nearly destroy her in ways she couldn't imagine. The call had come at 7 in the morning, just as Sarah was making coffee with hands that still shook from the previous night's confrontation and the sleepless hours that had followed. She had barely closed her eyes, her mind spinning through possibilities and escape routes, all of which seemed to lead to the same conclusion. She was trapped in a marriage with a man who saw her as property rather than a person. Brad's name on her phone screen made her stomach clench with dread, but she answered anyway, hoping against hope that he had somehow come to his senses overnight and was calling to apologize. Sarah, baby, I'm so sorry. His voice was soft, remorseful, nothing like the cold stranger who had shattered her world 12 hours earlier. I was tired, stressed about the quarterly reports and the Henderson merger. I said terrible things that I didn't mean, things that don't represent how I really feel about you and our marriage. Can you forgive me? Sarah had gripped the phone tighter, her free hand wrapped around her coffee mug like an anchor in a storm that threatened to sweep her away. The whiplash from his sudden change in tone was almost as devastating as his cruelty had been, leaving her dizzy and confused and desperate for something solid to hold on to. Brad, don't do this. Don't pretend last night didn't happen. It did happen, and I hate myself for it. Elna means nothing to me, Sarah. She's just someone who was there when I was weak and scared about our future, about the pressure I'm under at work. But you're my wife. You're the woman I love, the only woman I've ever truly loved. The words she had longed to hear sounded hollow now, but some treacherous part of her heart still wanted to believe them with a desperation that frightened her. That was the cruelest part of emotional manipulation, Sarah was learning. It fed on the love that remained even after trust had died, using that love as a weapon against the very person who felt it. The pregnancy test, Brad. She's having your baby. She's lying. Brad's voice carried just the right note of frustrated honesty, the tone of a man wrongfully accused of something terrible. She's trying to trap me, to break up our marriage so she can get her hands on what we've built together. But I know it's not mine, Sarah. I've been careful. I would never risk our future for someone like her. Sarah closed her eyes, wanting desperately to believe him, despite everything her rational mind was telling her. The alternative was too devastating to accept completely. If their entire marriage had been a lie, if every moment of love and tenderness had been calculated manipulation, then she had been living as a stranger to her own life for 3 years. I don't know what to believe anymore, she whispered, hating how weak and lost she sounded. Then let me prove it to you. Come away with me this weekend. Just the two of us. Like it used to be in the beginning, when we couldn't get enough of each other. No phones, no distractions, no Elena, no work pressures. Just us talking and remembering why we fell in love and figuring out how to save what we've built together. Where? That mountain resort we talked about visiting last year. The one with the hiking trails and the beautiful views that you bookmarked on your computer. We'll have time to think, to reconnect, to figure out how to move forward together. Sarah had hesitated, every instinct screaming warnings she couldn't quite articulate or understand. But the alternative was facing the complete destruction of her life, the loss of everything she had believed in and worked for, and she wasn't ready for that level of devastation. Some part of her still wanted to believe that the man she had loved for 6 years was still in there somewhere, buried beneath the stranger who had emerged the night before. Okay, she had said finally, but Brad, if you're lying to me about any of this, if this is some kind of game or manipulation, I'm not lying, baby. I love you more than life itself. Let me prove it to you. 3 hours later, they were driving up the winding mountain road toward the resort, Brad's hand covering hers on the center console with the same gentle possessiveness that had once made her feel cherished and protected. He was being everything she remembered from their early days together and everything she had missed during the months of his growing distance. Attentive, romantic, gentle, funny. He brought her favorite coffee from the shop near their house, played their wedding song on the radio, told her stories about his childhood that made her laugh despite everything that had happened between them. It was easy to pretend, in that car climbing toward the sky through pine forests and mountain meadows, that the previous night had been some terrible nightmare that they could wake up from together. Easy to believe that their marriage could be saved, that the man she loved was still somewhere inside the stranger who had crushed her spirit with such casual cruelty. The mountain air was crisp and clean when they arrived at the resort, a rustic lodge perched on the edge of a spectacular canyon that took Sarah's breath away. Other couples walked the trails hand in hand, their laughter echoing off the rock walls and mixing with the sound of wind through the pine trees. Children ran through the lobby while their parents checked in, the sound of family happiness that Sarah had always imagined for her own future, filling the space with joy and hope. It's beautiful, Sarah had said, meaning it completely. The view stretched for miles in every direction, an endless expanse of wilderness that made their problems seem small and manageable and far away from the real world. "Not as beautiful as you," Brad had replied, kissing her temple with the same tenderness that had made her fall in love with him 6 years ago. That evening, they had dinner by candlelight in the resort's restaurant, talking carefully around the painful subjects that threatened to destroy them, focusing instead on shared memories and tentative hopes for the future. Brad was charming and attentive, asking thoughtful questions and listening to her answers with the kind of focused attention that had once made her feel like the most interesting woman in the world. He asked about her dreams, her fears, her hopes for their future together, and seemed genuinely interested in her responses. Other diners smiled at them approvingly, seeing a couple working through their problems with grace and love and mutual respect. The waitress commented on what a lovely couple they made, how obvious their love for each other was, how lucky they were to have found each other. "I want us to try again," Brad had said over dessert, his eyes sincere and loving in the flickering candlelight. "Really try this time. No more late nights at the office. No more letting work come between us. No more taking each other for granted. You're the most important thing in my life, Sarah. I lost sight of that, but I want to make it right. What about Elena? I'll transfer her to another department first thing Monday morning. Better yet, I'll fire her completely. I don't want anything or anyone coming between us ever again." Sarah had almost convinced herself that everything would be okay. Almost. Brad was saying all the right things, making all the right promises, showing her the attention and affection she had been craving for months. The man across from her was the man she had married, the man who had held her when she cried, the man who had promised to love her forever. But that night, alone in their cabin while Brad showered, Sarah had found his phone buzzing with text messages. The name on the screen made her blood freeze and her hands shake. Elena Torres. Against every instinct, against every principle she had about privacy and trust in relationships, Sarah had opened the messages. What she read there destroyed the last of her hope and revealed the true depth of Brad's deception. The text messages on Brad's phone painted a picture so horrifying that Sarah's hands shook violently as she read them in the dim light of their cabin bathroom. Her heart pounding so hard she was afraid Brad would hear it over the sound of the running shower. Each word was a knife to her heart, each message confirmation that the man she loved was planning something unthinkable and monstrous. "Elena, is it done yet? I'm getting impatient sitting here waiting for news. The longer we wait, the more suspicious people will become about the timing. Brad, tomorrow morning during our reconciliation hike, the trail I scouted yesterday has a perfect drop with no witnesses and no cameras. Just a tragic accident during what everyone will think was a romantic attempt to save our marriage. Elena, and you're absolutely sure about the insurance money? We can't afford any complications or investigations that might expose us. Brad, $2 million life insurance policy that I convinced her to increase last year, plus her inheritance that's already in joint accounts and becomes mine completely when she's gone. We'll be set for life, baby. Just a few more hours and we're free to be together. Elena, I love you so much. See you when you get back tomorrow night. Don't let her suffer too much if you can help it. Brad, she won't feel a thing, I promise. One push when she's looking at the view and it's over. Quick and clean. Elena, what if someone sees you? What if there are other hikers on the trail? Brad, I've got it all planned out. The trail I picked is remote, no cell service, perfect drop onto rocks that will make it look like an accident. I'll be the devastated husband who tried to save her, but couldn't reach her in time. Elena, you're so smart, so careful. This is why I love you. We're going to be so happy together. Brad, just you, me, and our baby. The family I always wanted. Sarah's entire world collapsed as she read those words, her legs giving out beneath her as she sank to the bathroom floor with her back against the door. The man sleeping 10 feet away wasn't trying to save their marriage or prove his love or give them a second chance. He was planning to murder her in cold blood and make it look like an accident so he could collect her life insurance and inheritance and start a new life with his pregnant mistress. Every romantic gesture over the past 24 hours, every tender word, every moment of hope he had given her had been calculated cruelty designed to get her alone in the mountains where no one would witness her death or question his story about a tragic accident. The hiking trail he had suggested so casually, the remote location he had chosen so carefully, the way he had insisted they leave their phones in the cabin for their morning walk to disconnect from technology and reconnect with each other. It was all part of his carefully constructed plan to kill her. Sarah had stumbled to the toilet, her stomach heaving, as the full scope of Brad's betrayal crashed over her like a physical force. Not only was he stealing her money and destroying her marriage, he was planning to end her life. The man she had trusted completely, the man who had held her when she cried, the man who had promised to love and protect her forever, was going to push her off a cliff and collect $2 million for his trouble. She tried to run then, grabbing her purse and keys with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, her mind filled with images of Brad's hands pushing her into empty space. But Brad was already awake when she emerged from the bathroom, standing in the doorway like a sentinel, his body blocking her only escape route with casual efficiency. "Sarah, what's wrong, baby? You look pale like you've seen a ghost." "I need some air," she had managed to say, clutching her purse against her chest like a shield that might somehow protect her from what was coming. "At midnight? That's dangerous, sweetheart. Mountain lions hunt at night, and there are steep drops everywhere around here. Easy to get lost in the dark and never be found." Brad had stepped closer, his body language shifting subtly from concerned husband to predator guarding his prey. "Come back to bed. We have a big day tomorrow." The words that should have sounded loving now carried a sinister double meaning that made her skin crawl and her blood run cold. A big day, the day he planned to kill her and make it look like an accident. "I just need to walk for a minute, clear my head about everything that's happened between us. It's dangerous out there in the dark, Sarah. You could fall, get hurt, disappear forever, and no one would ever find you." Brad had moved to block the door completely, his 6-foot frame filling the doorway. "Come back to bed. Everything will be clearer in the morning light." Sarah had looked into his eyes and seen death waiting there, patient and calculating and absolutely certain of its success. But she had also seen something else, the absolute confidence of a man who believed his victim was helpless and had no idea what was coming. Brad didn't think she knew about his plan. He didn't think she was capable of fighting back or outsmarting him or surviving what he had planned for her. That arrogance would be his first mistake, but it might also be her only chance. "You're right," Sarah had said, forcing herself to smile and seem calm despite the terror clawing at her chest. "I'm just nervous about tomorrow, about us, about our future, about whether we can really make this work." "Everything's going to be perfect tomorrow," Brad had replied, and the promise in his voice had made her skin crawl with its hidden meaning. "I guarantee it will be a day we'll never forget." Sarah had returned to bed, but she hadn't slept a single moment. She had lain beside her would-be killer, staring at the ceiling and planning her own survival with the desperate creativity of someone who knew she had only hours left to live. She couldn't run. Brad would catch her before she reached her car, and even if she escaped, he would just find another opportunity to kill her. She couldn't call for help. He had insisted they leave their phones behind to disconnect from the world, and the nearest help was miles away, down winding mountain roads. Her only chance was to turn Brad's plan against him somehow, to find a way to survive what was coming and expose him for what he really was before he could complete his plan and disappear with Elena and their unborn child. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances, Sarah had made peace with the possibility that she might not survive the day. But she was determined that if she died, Brad wouldn't profit from it. She would leave evidence, create doubt, make sure that even if he succeeded in killing her, his perfect crime would eventually unravel. She had written a letter on resort stationery, explaining everything she had discovered about Brad's affair and his plan to kill her, and hidden it in her suitcase where housekeeping would eventually find it. She had scratched Brad's initials and the date into the wooden dresser with her engagement ring, where investigators might notice them if they looked carefully enough. She had left a trail of evidence that would point to murder rather than accident, insurance fraud rather than tragic misfortune. Then she had kissed her sleeping husband goodbye, tasting the betrayal on his lips and prepared to fight for her life with everything she had. The trail Brad chose was perfect for murder, and Sarah could see why he had selected it so carefully during his scouting trip the day before. It wound along the edge of a steep canyon with stunning views that would naturally draw tourists to the very edge where the ground fell away into nothing but air and death. The wooden railings were waist-high at best, more suggestion than protection, and there were multiple spots where someone could easily slip or be pushed without any witnesses to see what really happened. Anyone could have an accident here. Anyone could fall. It would be so easy to believe that a distraught wife, overwhelmed by emotion during a reconciliation hike, had simply gotten too close to the edge while trying to get a better view of the spectacular canyon below. "Isn't this incredible?" Brad had said as they walked, his arm around Sarah's shoulders in a gesture that now felt more like restraint than affection. "Look at that view. It makes you feel so small and insignificant compared to the power of nature." Sarah had looked, forcing herself to appreciate the beauty, even as terror clawed at her chest. 200 feet straight down to jagged rocks and certain death. The morning sun made the canyon walls glow red and gold, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Other hikers had passed them early on the trail, but they were alone now, exactly as Brad had planned when he chose this remote section of the path. "It makes you feel so small," Sarah had replied, trying to keep her voice steady and normal. Every step forward felt like walking toward her own execution, but she couldn't let Brad see her fear. Not yet. She needed to maintain the pretense that she suspected nothing until the very last moment. "Small problems in a big world," Brad had agreed, and she heard the double meaning in his words with crystal clarity. His grip on her shoulder tightened almost imperceptibly, steering her toward the most dangerous section of the overlook. "Sometimes people just disappear out here, get too close to the edge, lose their footing, and nature takes care of the rest. No one to blame, nothing anyone could have done differently." They had stopped at a scenic overlook where the trail curved closest to the cliff edge, the spot Brad had obviously chosen for its combination of beauty and isolation. A wooden railing separated hikers from the drop, but it was only waist-high, more suggestion than protection. The nearest other hikers were specks in the distance, too far away to help but close enough to serve as witnesses to his grief after the fact. "Sarah," Brad had said, his voice taking on the gentle tone he used when he wanted something important, "I need you to know how sorry I am about everything, about Elena, about the things I said last night, about hurting you so deeply." Sarah had turned to face him, seeing the lie written across his handsome features with perfect clarity now that she knew what to look for. "I know you are. I want to start over completely. Fresh slate, clean beginning. No more secrets between us. No more lies or deceptions or misunderstandings." "No more secrets," Sarah had agreed, her hand moving instinctively to her pocket where she had hidden a small recording device she had purchased from the resort gift shop the night before. Whatever happened next, she wanted his confession recorded for posterity. "Good." Brad's smile had been warm and loving, the expression of a devoted husband trying to repair his marriage. "Because I have one more secret to tell you, and then everything will be clear between us." That was when his mask had finally fallen away completely. The gentle expression vanished like smoke in the wind, replaced by cold calculation and something that might have been hunger for violence. His hands had moved to her shoulders, no longer tender, but gripping with painful intensity that would leave bruises if she lived long enough for them to develop. "The secret is that I never loved you, Sarah. Not for one single day of our marriage. You were useful, nothing more. Your money was useful. Your trust was useful. Your complete inability to see what was right in front of your face was incredibly useful. But love, you were always too needy, too clingy, too desperate for affection and validation. It was exhausting pretending to care about your feelings and your dreams and your pathetic fantasies about domestic bliss." Sarah felt her heart break all over again, but this time she was ready for it. The pain was still devastating, but it was also confirmation that everything she had suspected was true. The man she had loved for 6 years had never existed except as a carefully constructed lie designed to exploit her trust and steal her money. "Then why did you marry me?" she asked, proud of how steady her voice sounded, despite the terror clawing at her chest. "Your grandmother's inheritance. $2.5 million that became community property the moment you said I do, like the naive little girl you've always been. Plus your life insurance policy that I convinced you to increase last year when I told you we needed to protect our future family. Another 2 million that becomes mine when you're gone. Aha, when I'm gone? Sarah kept her voice level, her finger pressed firmly on the record button hidden in her pocket. Tragic accident during a reconciliation hike. Grieving wife gets too close to the edge while admiring the beautiful view, loses her footing, falls to her death while her devastated husband watches helplessly from a safe distance. Brad's hands had moved from her shoulders to her arms, positioning her closer to the railing, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment. I'll be devastated, of course. The widower who tried so hard to save his marriage but lost his beloved wife to a cruel twist of fate. Other hikers were still visible in the distance, too far away to help but close enough to serve as witnesses to his grief after the fact. Perfect positioning for his story about trying unsuccessfully to save her. People will comfort me, Brad had continued conversationally, as if discussing dinner plans rather than her imminent murder. They'll tell me it wasn't my fault, that I shouldn't blame myself for not being able to reach you in time. Elena will be there to help me through my grief, of course. We'll wait a respectful amount of time before going public with our relationship, maybe 6 months or so. You've thought of everything, Sarah had said, marveling at the depth of his planning and the coldness of his calculations. I have. Even the timing is perfect. Elena's pregnancy is just starting to show, which fits perfectly with the timeline of finding comfort in each other's arms after my tragic loss. We'll say grief brought us together, that we found healing and shared affection. Very romantic, very tragic. People love that kind of story. The baby, Sarah whispered, the final piece of his betrayal clicking into place. You got her pregnant on purpose. Of course. Elena understands what I need from a partner. She's ambitious, focused, willing to do whatever it takes to get what she wants. Unlike you, with your pathetic dreams of suburban domesticity and white picket fences. The cruelty in his voice was breathtaking and absolute. This wasn't just about money or even about replacing her with Elena. This was about the complete erasure of everything Sarah had believed about her life and her worth as a human being. There's just one problem with your plan, Sarah said, meeting his eyes directly. What's that? I know about it. The moment Sarah spoke those words, Brad's entire demeanor changed like a switch being flipped. The practiced charm vanished completely, replaced by something primal and dangerous that made her realize she was looking at the real Brad Mitchell for the first time in their relationship. His grip on her arms tightened until she could feel bones grinding together, and his eyes went flat and cold like a predator's that had been interrupted while stalking its prey. What did you say? I said I know about your plan. I read your text messages last night while you were in the shower. I know about Elena's pregnancy, about the insurance money, about everything you and she have been planning. I know you brought me here to kill me. For a heartbeat, Brad looked genuinely surprised, as if the possibility that his victim might discover his plan had never occurred to him. Then his expression shifted to something that might have been respect if it hadn't been wrapped in such obvious malice and contempt. Clever girl, I underestimated you completely. I thought you were too trusting, too naive, too desperate to believe in our marriage to see what was right in front of your face. You did. But it doesn't matter now. Brad's voice was calm, conversational, as if they were discussing hiking trails rather than her imminent murder. Knowing doesn't change anything about your situation. You're still here with me, alone and isolated. I'm still stronger than you, and you're still going to fall to your death while I watch. Brad had started pushing her backward toward the railing, using his greater size and strength to force her closer to the edge with methodical determination. Sarah fought back desperately, clawing at his hands, trying to break free from his grip. But he was too strong and too determined, and had the advantage of planning and preparation. Help me, Sarah had screamed at the top of her lungs, hoping the distant hikers might hear her voice echoing off the canyon walls. Somebody help me, please. Scream all you want, Brad had panted, forcing her back another step toward the edge. By the time anyone gets here, you'll already be gone, and I'll be the grieving husband who tried desperately to save you. I'll tell them you were upset about our marriage problems. That you got too close to the edge while you were crying and lost your footing. Tragic accident, just like I planned. Sarah's back had hit the wooden railing, the only thing between her and a 200-foot drop to certain death on the rocks below. Brad's hands had moved to her throat, not quite choking her, but making his intentions crystal clear and giving her a preview of what was coming. "Any last words before you take your final step?" he had asked, his breath hot against her face and reeking of coffee and deception. "Yes," Sarah had gasped, fighting for every breath. "You forgot about the recording." "What recording?" Sarah had smiled grimly despite her terror, her hand moving to her pocket, where the small device had been capturing every word of his confession since they started their conversation. "The one that's been running since we started talking. Every word you just said, every threat you just made, every detail of your plan, all of it recorded for posterity." Brad's eyes had widened with shock and then narrowed with fury so intense it seemed to radiate heat. "Give it to me right now." "Never." That was when Brad had snapped completely. With a roar of rage that echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, he had shoved Sarah with all his strength, sending her tumbling backward over the railing into empty space and what should have been certain death. The fall had lasted forever, and no time at all. Sarah screamed as the ground vanished beneath her feet, her arms windmilling desperately as she plummeted toward the rocks below at terminal velocity. The canyon walls rushed past in a blur of red stone in morning sunlight, and for a terrifying moment she thought this was how her story would end. Broken on the rocks at the bottom of a canyon while her husband collected insurance money and built a new life with his pregnant mistress. Then something had caught her fall with bone-jarring impact. A narrow ledge jutting out from the cliff face, barely wide enough to support her body, but strong enough to stop her descent and save her life. Sarah hit it hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs and sending waves of pain through her ribs and back. But she was alive against all odds. Above her, Brad's face had appeared at the edge of the overlook, silhouetted against the morning sky. For just a moment, she saw something that might have been relief in his expression, as if some small part of him was glad she had survived. Then it hardened into calculation again as he realized what her survival meant for his carefully constructed plan. "Sarah," he had called down, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air and dripping with false concern. "Oh my God, are you hurt? Can you move? Help me," Sarah had gasped, clinging to the rocky ledge with hands that were already slippery with blood from the rough stone. "Please, Brad, I can't hold on much longer. Pull me up." "I know you can't," Brad had replied, and there was something almost gentle in his voice that was more terrifying than any threat. "I'm sorry it has to be this way, but you should have just accepted the divorce quietly like a civilized person. You forced my hand by being so suspicious and paranoid." Sarah had looked up at him in disbelief, even now amazed by his ability to make everything her fault. Even after confessing to planning her murder, he was trying to make this about her failures as a wife, rather than his crimes as a human being. "The recording," she had managed to say through gritted teeth, her arms burning with the effort of supporting her body weight. "It's still running. Everyone will know what you did to me." "Will they?" Brad had smiled down at her with genuine amusement, as if she had said something particularly naive. "A recording device that goes over a cliff with your body? I don't think anyone will ever find it among all those rocks and debris at the bottom of the canyon." He had been right, of course. Even if the device survived the fall, which was highly unlikely, no one would think to look for it among the rocks and debris at the bottom of the canyon. Brad would collect her broken body, weep over her tragic death, and walk away a wealthy widower with a clean conscience and a perfect alibi that no one would ever question. Sarah's grip had started to slip, her strength ebbing away with each passing second. Her arms burned with the effort of supporting her body weight, and she could feel her fingers losing their hold on the stone, despite her desperate efforts to hang on. The rough stone was tearing her palms to shreds, and her ribs screamed in agony from the impact with the ledge. Below her, the canyon floor waited with patient inevitability, promising an end to her pain and struggle. It would be so easy to just let go, to stop fighting, to accept that Brad had won and that her story would end here on this remote mountain trail where no one would ever know the truth about what really happened. But just as her fingers began to lose their hold on the stone, she had heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the distant sound of helicopter rotors echoing off the canyon walls like mechanical thunder. The helicopter had appeared like something out of a dream or a miracle, black and sleek against the morning sky with the kind of expensive sophistication that marked it as belonging to someone with serious money and resources. It hovered over the canyon with mechanical precision, the downdraft from its rotors creating whirlwinds of dust and debris that made it hard to see clearly, but filled Sarah with hope for the first time since she had discovered Brad's text messages. Sarah had barely dared to hope that salvation was possible. Helicopters passed over these mountains regularly, tourists taking scenic flights, search and rescue operations, wealthy thrill seekers exploring the wilderness from above with expensive equipment and professional pilots. There was no reason to think this particular aircraft would notice her predicament or have any reason to care about one woman clinging to a ledge in the middle of nowhere. But as the aircraft descended closer to the cliff face with obvious intention and purpose, Sarah had seen a figure in the open doorway that made her heart leap with possibility. A man with dark hair and sharp, intelligent features, wearing expensive outdoor clothing that marked him as someone accustomed to wealth and adventure. He was looking directly at her with the kind of focused intensity that suggested this was no accidental rescue mission. Above her, Brad had stepped back from the edge, clearly panicked by this unexpected development that threatened to destroy his carefully constructed plan. Sarah had heard him shouting something, but the helicopter noise had drowned out his words completely. Not that it mattered anymore. Whatever lie he was preparing to tell, the evidence of her fall and his failure to help her would speak louder than any explanation he could fabricate. The man in the helicopter had signaled to someone Sarah couldn't see, then rappelled down toward her ledge with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested extensive training and experience with dangerous rescues. As he drew closer, Sarah had gotten a better look at her unlikely savior. He was perhaps 35 years old, with the kind of rugged handsomeness that suggested regular physical activity and excellent health care. His clothes were casual but expensive, the kind of outdoor gear that cost more than most people made in a month, and was designed for serious adventurers rather than weekend hikers. "Ma'am," he had called out as he reached her position, his voice calm and authoritative despite the precarious circumstances and the wind from the helicopter rotors. "I'm James Rothschild. I'm going to get you out of here safely." Rothschild. Even in her desperate state, clinging to a cliff face and fighting for her life, Sarah had recognized the name immediately. One of the wealthiest families in the country, known for their business empire, philanthropic efforts, and tendency to appear in the society pages of expensive magazines. What was a billionaire doing in a helicopter over this particular canyon at this particular moment when she needed rescue more than she had ever needed anything in her life? "Can you move your arms without losing your grip?" James had asked, already securing a rescue harness around her waist with practiced efficiency and obvious expertise. "I think so," Sarah had gasped, her voice barely audible over the helicopter noise but filled with gratitude and relief. "Good. I'm going to lift you up to the aircraft. Try to stay as still as possible and let me do all the work. You're safe now." The ascent had been terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, a journey from certain death to miraculous salvation that Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. She had clung to James as they rose through the air, the canyon floor falling away beneath them until it became a distant abstraction rather than an immediate threat. The ledge that had saved her life grew smaller and smaller until it was just another feature of the rock face, no longer the narrow margin between life and death, but simply part of the landscape. In the helicopter, skilled medical personnel had immediately begun treating her injuries with the kind of professional competence that money could buy. Nothing was broken, but she was bruised and bloodied, her hands torn from gripping the rough stone, her ribs aching from the impact with the ledge. They cleaned her wounds, checked her vital signs, and assured her that she would make a full recovery from her ordeal. "What's your name?" James had asked as the medical team worked, his voice gentle but commanding, in the way of someone accustomed to being in charge of important situations. "Sarah Mitchell." "And the man up there?" James had gestured toward the cliff edge where Brad was still visible, now frantically waving his arms in what was presumably meant to look like distress, rather than the panic of a murderer whose plan had been interrupted. "My husband," Sarah had said, the words bitter in her mouth and weighted with betrayal. "He pushed me. He tried to kill me for the insurance money." James's expression had hardened with cold fury, but he hadn't seemed surprised by her revelation. "We'll deal with that. Right now, let's focus on getting you proper medical attention and somewhere safe where he can't reach you." As the helicopter had banked away from the canyon, Sarah had caught a glimpse of Brad standing alone on the trail, his figure growing smaller and more insignificant with distance. Even from far away, she could see his fury and frustration at the failure of his perfect plan. His carefully orchestrated murder had been interrupted by the last thing he could have anticipated. A billionaire with a helicopter who happened to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to save her life. But as they flew toward the city in safety, Sarah had realized that her rescue was only the beginning of her problems, not the end of them. She was still legally married to a man who had tried to kill her and would undoubtedly try again if he discovered she had survived. She had no money of her own, no job to return to, no support system beyond the kindness of a wealthy stranger who had no reason to help her beyond basic human decency. The fight for her life was over, but the fight for justice in her future was just beginning. "Where are we going?" Sarah had asked James as the helicopter angled toward a gleaming medical facility that looked more like a luxury hotel than a hospital. "Somewhere safe where you can recover and we can figure out how to handle your husband," James had replied, his tone suggesting that he was not a man who left important details to chance. "We'll make sure you get the best possible care, and then we'll discuss what comes next." There had been something in his voice and manner that suggested James Rothschild was not someone who walked away from problems once he became involved in them. Sarah didn't know why he had been in that helicopter at that exact moment, or why he seemed so determined to help a complete stranger, but she was grateful beyond words for his intervention. For the first time in 24 hours, she felt like she might actually survive this nightmare and find a way to reclaim her life from the wreckage of Brad's betrayal. The private medical facility where James had taken Sarah was unlike any hospital she had ever seen or imagined existed outside of movies about the lifestyles of the extremely wealthy. The rooms looked more like five-star hotel suites than medical wards, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking manicured gardens, original artwork on the walls, and furniture that probably cost more than most people's cars. The staff moved with quiet efficiency, attending to her needs without the rushed urgency typical of emergency rooms, as if they had all the time in the world to ensure her complete comfort and recovery. But despite the luxury surrounding her and the obvious expense of her care, Sarah felt like she was living in a waking nightmare that grew worse with each passing hour. The television in her room played news reports that made her blood run cold and her hands shake with rage and disbelief. According to every major network and newspaper, Sarah Mitchell was dead. Local businessman Brad Mitchell reported the tragic death of his wife earlier today, the news anchor said with practiced solemnity and just the right amount of emotion. Sarah Mitchell, 28, fell to her death during a hiking trip intended to repair their troubled marriage. Her body has not yet been recovered due to the difficult terrain and dangerous conditions, but authorities consider the fall unsurvivable based on witness statements and the evidence at the scene. The screen showed a photograph of Sarah and Brad from their wedding day 3 years ago, both of them smiling and radiant with happiness that now seemed like a cruel joke played by fate. Below it, the headline read in bold letters, "Tragic End to Marriage Reconciliation Attempt." Sarah had stared at her own obituary with a mixture of horror, rage, and disbelief that threatened to consume her completely. Brad had called in her death before her body had even been found or recovered. He had prepared his grief, rehearsed his sorrow, and presented himself to the world as a devastated widower before the rescue helicopter had even left the canyon or brought her to safety. The speed and efficiency of his deception was breathtaking and terrifying. "He's claiming I'm dead," Sarah had said to James when he came to check on her progress and ensure she was receiving proper care. "He's already giving interviews to reporters about our troubled marriage and his tragic loss. Look at him. He's actually crying on camera." James had studied the television screen with cold, calculating eyes that reminded Sarah of a predator evaluating prey or a chess master planning moves several steps ahead. He works fast and thinks on his feet. Very calculated, very thorough, very dangerous. What do I do? How do I prove I'm alive without alerting him to where I am? If he finds out I survived his attempt to kill me, you don't prove anything yet. Not until we're ready. James had turned away from the television to face her directly, his expression serious and intense. Your husband tried to kill you once, and he obviously put a lot of planning and preparation into that attempt. If he discovers you survived, he'll try again, and next time he'll be more careful and more thorough. So what do I do? Stay hidden forever while he profits from my supposed death? Right now, your supposed death gives you the one advantage you've never had in this relationship with him. What's that? He thinks he's won completely. He thinks his plan worked perfectly, and he's gotten away with murder. Over the next few days, Sarah had watched in fascination, disgust, and growing fury as Brad played his role of grieving widower to absolute perfection. He appeared on local television multiple times, always dignified in his grief, speaking about their marriage with just the right mixture of love, regret, and hopeful determination that had been tragically cut short. Sarah and I had our problems like any married couple, he had told a sympathetic interviewer, his voice catching slightly in what appeared to be genuine emotion. We were trying to work through them, trying to rebuild what we had lost over the past year. She was so beautiful, so full of life and hope for our future together. I keep thinking about our last conversation, how optimistic we both were about starting fresh and making our marriage work. The interviewer had leaned forward with practiced empathy and just the right amount of professional concern. This must be incredibly difficult for you to talk about so soon after such a tragedy. It is, but I think Sarah would want people to know how hard we were trying, how much love there still was between us despite our problems. Brad had paused to compose himself, his eyes glistening with what appeared to be genuine tears that fooled everyone watching. But I know she would want me to move forward eventually to find happiness again. She was that generous, that loving, that concerned about my well-being even when we were struggling. Sarah had thrown a water glass at the television screen, watching it shatter with satisfaction that was immediately replaced by renewed fury. Brad was rewriting their entire relationship history, painting himself as the devoted husband and her as the understanding wife who would want him to find love again after a respectful period of mourning. But even as Brad performed his grief for the cameras and the public, Sarah had noticed something else in the news coverage that made her stomach turn. Elena Torres appeared at his side in several shots, identified as a close family friend who is helping Brad through this difficult time. She was dressed conservatively and appropriately for a grieving friend, but to Sarah's trained eye, the slight curve of her belly was unmistakable even beneath loose-fitting clothing designed to conceal her condition. "Look at her," Sarah had said to James, pointing at the screen with shaking hands. "She's not even trying to hide it anymore." Hide what exactly? The pregnancy. She's carrying Brad's child, and now that I'm supposedly dead, they don't have to pretend she's just his assistant anymore. They can start building their story about finding comfort in each other's arms during his time of grief. James had studied Elena's image with the same calculating expression he brought to everything, analyzing her appearance and body language with the attention to detail that had probably made him successful in business. How far along would you estimate she is? Maybe 4 months, 5 at most. Sarah had done the math in her head, each calculation like a knife to her heart, and another piece of evidence of Brad's long-term deception. Which means she got pregnant while Brad was still pretending to love me, still talking about starting a family with me, still playing the role of devoted husband who was trying to save our marriage. Perfect motive, James had said simply. For what? Murder. He wanted you gone permanently so he could start fresh with her and their child. No messy divorce proceedings, no splitting of assets, no lengthy legal battles over custody or support payments. Just a clean slate, a tragic accident, and a lot of insurance money to fund their new life together. Sarah had felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in her luxurious room. She had known Brad was planning to kill her for money, but seeing him with Elena made it personal in a way that was almost unbearable to contemplate. This wasn't just about greed or financial gain. It was about replacement, about erasure, about wanting her to disappear so completely that he could pretend their marriage had never happened and start over with a clean conscience. "What do we do now?" Sarah had asked, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of the problem and her own powerlessness to fight back against someone who had all the advantages. "Now you disappear completely while I do some investigating of my own. Your husband isn't the only one who can play a long game and plan several moves ahead." Amatorn. James had arranged for Sarah to stay in a private wing of his estate while she recovered from her injuries, and they planned their next move carefully. The Rothschild mansion was like something out of a fairy tale or a movie about the lifestyles of the extremely wealthy, with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and staff who attended to her every need with discretion and professionalism that money couldn't buy. It was there, in the safety and luxury of his sprawling estate, that Sarah had finally felt secure enough to grieve properly for the life she had lost and the person she had been. She wasn't just mourning her marriage or even her near-death experience on the mountain. She was mourning the person she had been, the trusting wife who had believed in happy endings, who had thought love could overcome any obstacle, who had never imagined that the person she trusted most in the world could be capable of such calculated cruelty. That woman had died on the mountain trail, and Sarah wasn't entirely sure who she was becoming in her place. But as she watched Brad and Elena build their new life on the foundation of her supposed death, Sarah felt something else growing inside her, alongside the grief and loss. It was cold and hard and absolutely unforgiving, like steel being forged in a fire that burned away everything soft and vulnerable. It was the desire for justice, and it was stronger than any emotion she had ever felt in her life. 3 months had passed since Sarah Mitchell officially died, and in that time, Brad had transformed himself into the perfect widower, with the kind of thoroughness and attention to detail that would have been admirable if it hadn't been built on murder and deception. He appeared at charity events with Elena at his side, the two of them presenting a picture of love born from mutual grief and shared comfort that the media found irresistible and the public ate up with enthusiasm. "Brad Mitchell and Elena Torres have found love again after shared loss," read one particularly nauseating headline that made Sarah throw her coffee mug across the room in fury. "The bereaved widower and his late wife's friend have discovered that sometimes the heart can heal through connection with another wounded soul seeking comfort and understanding." Sarah had to admit that the narrative construction was masterful, even as it made her physically ill to read about her own supposed death being used as the foundation for their love story. By positioning Elena as her friend, rather than Brad's secretary and mistress, they had created a story that painted them both as sympathetic figures rather than adulterers and murderers. No one questioned the timeline too closely, and Brad's grief seemed so genuine and heartfelt that few people thought to dig deeper into his motivations or examine the convenient timing of his recovery. But James Rothschild had been digging with the kind of resources and determination that only unlimited wealth could provide, and what he had found was damning enough to bury Brad forever if they played their cards correctly. "Your husband has been busier than we initially thought," James had said during one of their strategy sessions, spreading a collection of financial documents across the conference table in his estate's private office, like a prosecutor laying out evidence for a grand jury. The room was lined with law books and expensive artwork, the kind of space where million-dollar deals were negotiated with handshakes and lives were changed with the stroke of a pen. Sarah had studied the papers with growing amazement and fury that threatened to overwhelm her completely. Bank accounts, investment portfolios, real estate holdings, everything she had brought to the marriage was being systematically converted to cash and moved into accounts that only Brad could access. The scope of his theft was breathtaking and complete. "How is any of this legal?" she had asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "It's not, technically speaking. As your husband, he has some access to joint assets during normal circumstances, but this level of liquidation should require probate court approval and oversight. He's gambling that no one will scrutinize the transactions too closely, and so far he's been absolutely right in that assumption." "And the insurance money?" $2.2 million paid out last week without any questions or investigations. The insurance company was completely satisfied with the death certificate and police report. No body required given the circumstances of the fall and the dangerous terrain. Sarah had felt sick with rage and helplessness. Not only had Brad tried to kill her, but he was actively profiting from her supposed death while building a new life with his pregnant mistress. The injustice of it was overwhelming and complete, made worse by the fact that she was powerless to stop it as long as the world believed she was dead and buried. "We have to stop him," she had said, her hands clenching into fists that she wanted to use to destroy something, anything that would make her feel less powerless. "We will, but we need to be smart and strategic about how we do it. Your husband has committed multiple felonies, attempted murder, insurance fraud, theft, conspiracy, but proving it will require more than just your testimony. We need hard evidence that will stand up in court and convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt." That was where James's resources had proved invaluable in ways that Sarah could never have imagined. Over the following weeks, he had assembled a team of private investigators, forensic accountants, and legal experts who worked with the kind of efficiency and thoroughness that only unlimited funding could provide. They operated like a sophisticated intelligence agency, gathering information and building a case with methodical precision. They had discovered that Brad's financial crimes extended far beyond just stealing Sarah's assets and insurance money. He had been embezzling from his own business partners for months, using Sarah's inheritance as collateral for loans he never intended to repay, and building his entire lifestyle on a foundation of fraud and deception that went back years before he had even met her. "He's not just a would-be murderer," James had explained during one of their strategy sessions. "He's a career criminal who got lucky when he married you. Your money and your trust gave him access to a level of wealth and respectability he could never have achieved on his own merit or through legitimate means. So what's our plan for destroying him? We're going to give him exactly what he wants," James had said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and promised terrible things for Brad Mitchell. "We're going to let him think he's won completely and gotten away with perfect murder. And then we're going to destroy him in the most public and humiliating way possible." The plan James had devised was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential impact. They would wait until Brad felt completely secure in his new life, until he had married Elena and fully integrated himself into high society as a respectable widower who had found love again after tragedy. Then, at the moment when his victory seemed most complete and unassailable, Sarah would return from the dead like a vengeful ghost. "The shock value alone will be devastating to his composure," James had explained, with obvious satisfaction. "But more importantly, it will force him to make mistakes and reveal his true nature in front of witnesses. Criminals who think they're safe get careless, and careless criminals make confessions that destroy them." Sarah had agreed to the plan wholeheartedly, but the waiting had been agony that tested her patience and resolve every single day. Every morning she watched Brad and Elena build their happiness on the foundation of her supposed death. Every evening, she saw him accept sympathy and support from people who believed his lies about being a grieving widower. Every night she remained dead to the world while her would-be murderer walked free and profited from his crime with impunity. During this time of exile and preparation, Sarah had begun to change in ways that surprised even her and would have amazed anyone who had known the trusting, naive woman she had been before Brad's betrayal. The soft vulnerability that had once defined her features was replaced by something harder and more determined. She worked out with James's personal trainer, studied law and finance with tutors he provided, and learned to channel her rage into cold, calculated planning that would have made Brad proud if he could have seen it. The woman who had fallen off that cliff had been a victim, helpless and trusting, and completely unprepared for the cruelty that humans were capable of inflicting on each other. The woman who would eventually rise from the dead would be something much more dangerous and formidable. "You're different," James had observed one evening as they reviewed the latest intelligence on Brad's activities and planned the final stages of their revenge. "How so?" "Stronger, more focused, more dangerous. The woman I rescued from that ledge was broken by betrayal and barely hanging on to life. The woman sitting across from me now looks like she could take on the world and win without breaking a sweat." Sarah had considered this assessment carefully. Maybe I needed to die to become who I was meant to be all along. And who is that? Someone who doesn't let people like Brad Mitchell win. Someone who fights back and makes them pay for their crimes. But finally, after months of careful preparation and surveillance, James had given her the signal she had been waiting for with growing anticipation. "It's time," he had said simply. The venue James had chosen for Sarah's resurrection was absolutely perfect for maximum impact and public humiliation. Brad and Elena's engagement party, held at an exclusive country club, attended by everyone who mattered in their social circle. The guest list included business partners, socialites, media figures, and city officials. Exactly the kind of influential audience whose witness would make denial impossible and ensure that the story would spread like wildfire through every important circle in the city. Sarah had stood in the bathroom of the country club, staring at her reflection in the ornate mirror and marveling at how much she had changed in the months since her supposed death. She looked different, stronger, more dangerous. The soft vulnerability that had once made her easy prey had been replaced by something that would make Brad Mitchell very, very sorry he had ever tried to destroy her. Tonight, she would stop being a victim and start being something much more terrifying. Tonight, she would become the ghost who would haunt Brad Mitchell for the rest of his miserable life. The country club ballroom was magnificent, decorated in gold and crystal for Brad and Elena's engagement celebration, with the kind of extravagance that money could buy and taste could refine. 200 of the city's most influential people mingled beneath chandeliers that cost more than most people's annual salaries, sipping champagne that was older than some of the guests, and offering congratulations to the happy couple who had found love after tragedy struck their lives. Brad looked every inch the successful businessman and grieving widower in his custom tuxedo, perfectly tailored to showcase his athletic build and expensive enough to signal his prosperity without being ostentatious. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, accepting condolences for his tragic loss and best wishes for his new beginning, with equal grace and apparent sincerity. Elena glowed beside him in a flowing gown that artfully concealed her advancing pregnancy, the picture of a woman who had found unexpected love after helping a friend through the darkest period of his life. "Such a beautiful story," Sarah heard one society matron say as she moved through the crowd unrecognized. Her new appearance and the simple fact that everyone believed she was dead providing perfect camouflage. To think that these two souls found each other in their darkest hour, that love could bloom even in the ashes of tragedy. It just proves that God has a plan for everyone, even when we can't see it ourselves. Sarah had to bite her tongue to keep from laughing out loud, or perhaps screaming at the top of her lungs. The choice between the two reactions seemed dangerously close as she listened to the guests praise Brad's courage in opening his heart again, and Elena's selflessness in helping him heal from his devastating loss. She had changed significantly in the months since her supposed death, and the transformation was both physical and psychological. Her hair was shorter and darker, her clothes more sophisticated and expensive thanks to James's resources, her bearing more confident and commanding. Combined with the simple fact that everyone believed she was dead and buried, it was enough to let her move through the party without immediate recognition from people who had known her in her previous life. But she wouldn't remain anonymous for much longer. James appeared at her elbow, impeccably dressed in a tuxedo that probably cost more than her first car, and radiating the kind of casual authority that comes with unlimited wealth and the power to change lives with a phone call. He drew respectful nods from other guests who recognized him as someone important, someone whose presence at their gathering elevated its status and significance. "Are you ready for this?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the classical music and sophisticated conversation that filled the ballroom. "I've been ready for months. I've been dreaming about this moment every night since I read those text messages. Remember, we need him to confess publicly in front of all these witnesses. Everything we've gathered is circumstantial without his admission of guilt in his own words. The recording from the mountain is powerful, but his lawyers will claim it was edited or taken out of context or obtained illegally." Sarah nodded, her hand moving to the tiny recording device hidden in her jewelry that would capture every word spoken in the next few minutes. This time, there would be no question about evidence, no possibility of denial or legal maneuvering that could save Brad from the consequences of his crimes. The moment came when Brad stepped onto the small stage at one end of the ballroom to address his guests, tapping his champagne glass with a silver spoon to call for attention. The room fell silent gradually as conversations died, and people turned toward the sound, their faces expectant and pleased to be included in what they assumed would be a touching moment of gratitude and love. "Friends," Brad began, his voice carrying easily through the room with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. "Elena and I want to thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate our engagement and our future together. We know that our happiness has come from tragedy, that we found each other in the aftermath of devastating loss that changed both our lives forever." Sarah felt her stomach turn as Brad continued his speech, painting himself as a devoted husband who had lost his beloved wife in a tragic accident while trying to save their marriage. He spoke about grief, about healing, about the courage to love again after experiencing such profound loss. The audience hung on every word, moved by his apparent sincerity and Elena's quiet strength beside him. "Sarah would have wanted me to be happy," Brad said, his voice breaking with practiced emotion that had fooled everyone for months. "She was that kind of person, generous, loving, selfless to a fault. I know she's watching over us tonight from heaven, giving us her blessing as we start this new chapter of our lives together." The audience murmured approval, some dabbing at their eyes with handkerchiefs as they were moved by his obvious love for his deceased wife and his courage in finding happiness again. Several people nodded knowingly, having heard similar sentiments from other widowers who had found new love after loss. It was a touching scene, made all the more powerful by Brad's obvious sincerity and the genuine affection between him and Elena. That was Sarah's cue for the performance of a lifetime. "How touching," she said, her voice cutting through the applause like a knife through silk, clear and strong, and carrying easily to every corner of the silent ballroom. "But I think you're wrong about what I would have wanted." The silence that followed was absolute and electric. 200 people turned toward the sound of her voice like flowers following the sun, their faces reflecting various stages of shock, confusion, disbelief, and dawning recognition. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips, and even the waitstaff stopped moving, as if time itself had paused. Sarah stepped forward into the light, letting everyone see her clearly for the first time. She was wearing a red dress that hugged her figure and commanded attention, her hair styled in waves that caught the chandelier light, her makeup perfect and her bearing confident. She looked like a woman attending a party, not a ghost rising from the dead to seek vengeance. "Hello, Brad," she said conversationally, her voice carrying clearly in the silent ballroom and landing like a bomb in the middle of his carefully constructed new life. "Miss me?" Brad's face went through a series of rapid changes that would have been comical if the situation hadn't been so serious. Shock, terror, fury, and finally a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. His champagne glass slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering on the marble floor with a sound like breaking crystal that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Elena simply stared with her mouth open in horror, one hand instinctively moving to protect her pregnant belly, as if Sarah's presence posed a physical threat. "Sarah?" Brad managed to choke out, his voice barely above a whisper and filled with disbelief. "But you're... How are you? This is impossible." "Alive? Yes, I am very much alive." "Disappointed?" The room erupted in whispers and gasps as people began to realize what they were witnessing and reach for their phones to record what was clearly going to be an unforgettable moment. Someone was already calling for security, others were frantically texting friends and relatives about what they were seeing, but most were simply staring in fascination at the impossible scene unfolding before them. This was better than any soap opera, more dramatic than any movie they had ever seen, more shocking than any scandal they had witnessed in their privileged lives. A woman returning from the dead to confront her husband at his engagement party to another woman? It was the kind of story that would be told and retold for years, maybe decades. "I don't understand," Brad said, stepping down from the stage on unsteady legs that barely supported his weight. "The police said the fall was... You couldn't have survived something like that. But I did survive, Brad. I survived your attempt to murder me, and I've spent the last 3 months learning some very interesting things about you and your business practices." Sarah had the entire room's attention now. 200 of the city's most powerful and influential people focused on her with rapt attention. She could see business leaders, political figures, and media personalities all hanging on her every word. Everything that happened here would be public knowledge by morning, reported in newspapers and broadcast on television stations across the country. Murder? Brad forced a laugh that sounded hollow and desperate in the silent ballroom. Sarah, you're obviously confused or suffering from some kind of trauma-induced delusion. You fell during our hike. It was a tragic accident that I've been living with every day since it happened. Was it really an accident? Because I remember you confessing your plan to kill me for the insurance money. I remember you pushing me off that cliff with your own hands. I remember you standing at the edge, watching me fall, making no attempt to save your wife. The crowd gasped collectively, the sound like wind rushing through the ballroom. People exchanged shocked glances and began whispering more urgently to each other as the implications of Sarah's words sank in. You're clearly suffering from some kind of mental breakdown brought on by the trauma, Brad said, but sweat was beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning, and his voice lacked conviction. The trauma of the fall, being alone in the wilderness for months, it's obviously affected your memory and your ability to distinguish reality from hallucination. Has it? Sarah pulled out her phone with theatrical timing and pressed play on an audio file that she had been saving for this exact moment. Brad's voice filled the room, crystal clear and utterly damning in its casual cruelty. The secret is that I never loved you, Sarah. Not for one day of our marriage. You were useful. Your money was useful. Your trust was useful. The recording continued, playing Brad's full confession in its entirety for everyone to hear. His admission that he had married her for money, his detailed plan to murder her for insurance, his mockery of her trust and love, his cruel dismissal of everything they had supposedly shared together. Every word was captured with perfect clarity, every threat and callous observation preserved for posterity and broadcast to the most influential people in the city. When the recording ended, the silence was deafening and pregnant with shock. Brad stood frozen in the center of the ballroom, his face pale and his hands shaking visibly. Elena had backed away from him as if he were contaminated, her own face a mask of horror and betrayal as she realized the full scope of what the man she loved had done and what it meant for her own future. That's not... I never said... That recording is fake, Brad stammered, but the evidence was irrefutable, and his protest sounded weak and desperate even to his own ears. Oh, but you did say all of that and more, Sarah said with gentle firmness, advancing on him like a predator stalking wounded prey. You planned my death down to the smallest detail, executed your plan with cold precision, and then collected my insurance money while playing the grieving widower for months. Very thorough, very calculated, very professional. Detective Maya Williams chose that moment to make her entrance, flanked by uniformed officers who had been waiting outside for Sarah's signal. She had been coordinating with James for weeks, gathering evidence and preparing arrest warrants based on the information his investigators had uncovered. Brad Mitchell, Detective Williams said formally, her voice carrying the weight of law and justice in final judgment. You're under arrest for the attempted murder of your wife, insurance fraud, embezzlement, and multiple counts of theft and conspiracy. The scene that followed was pure chaos. Brad struggled briefly as the officers moved to handcuff him, shouting denials and accusations that no one believed anymore. Elena collapsed into a chair, sobbing as she realized her own complicity in the scheme and the destruction of everything she had thought was real and permanent. Guests pulled out phones to record every moment and call reporters, sensing that they were witnessing a story that would dominate headlines for weeks and give them social currency for years to come. The ballroom buzzed with excited conversations as people processed what they had just seen and began spreading the news to anyone who would listen. But Sarah felt only a profound sense of relief washing over her, like a cleansing tide. For months, she had been legally dead while her would-be killer lived freely, profiting from his crime and building a new life on the foundation of her supposed corpse. Now, finally, justice was being served in the most public and humiliating way possible. As Brad was led away in handcuffs, he turned back to look at her one last time, with his hands bound behind him like a common criminal. The mask of charm and manipulation had fallen away completely, revealing the cold predator beneath who had always been there, waiting for the right moment to strike and destroy everything she held dear. "You should have stayed dead," he hissed, his voice filled with venom and hatred that made several nearby guests step back in alarm. "But I didn't," Sarah replied calmly, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom and ensuring that everyone heard her final words to the man who had tried to erase her from existence. "And that's going to cost you everything you thought you had won." 6 months later, Sarah stood in a courthouse packed with reporters and spectators and watched Brad Mitchell sentenced to 25 years to life for attempted murder, insurance fraud, embezzlement, and a host of other charges that James's investigators had uncovered during their thorough examination of his business practices. Elena received a shorter sentence for her role in the conspiracy, but both of their lives were effectively over, their reputations destroyed beyond any possibility of redemption. The trial had been a media sensation, covered by every major news outlet and dissected by legal experts who marveled at the audacity of Brad's scheme and the poetic justice of his downfall. Sarah had testified with calm precision, her voice never wavering as she described the betrayal and attempted murder in clinical detail that left no room for doubt about Brad's guilt. She had reclaimed her assets, her identity, and her future with the help of James's legal team. More importantly, she had found something she never expected to discover in the aftermath of such devastating betrayal: love with James Rothschild, the man who had saved her life and helped her reclaim it from the ashes of her supposed death. As they walked out of the courthouse together into the bright sunshine of a new day, Sarah reflected on how completely her life had changed since that morning on the mountain trail. She was no longer the trusting, naive woman who had believed love could overcome any obstacle or that good intentions were enough to protect someone from harm. But she was also no longer the victim who had dangled helplessly from a cliff, begging for mercy from a man who felt none for her suffering. She was a survivor, and that made all the difference in the world. The pregnant wife who had been pushed off a cliff was dead and buried forever. But the woman who had climbed back up from the depths of betrayal and despair was stronger, smarter, and more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. And she was just getting started with the rest of her life. If this story left you shocked, inspired, or just completely speechless, you're not alone. Sarah's journey from victim to victor reminds us that sometimes our darkest moments become the foundation for our greatest comebacks. But here's what I need from you. If this story made you feel something, anger at Brad's betrayal, relief at Sarah's rescue, satisfaction at his downfall, hit that like button right now. Your engagement tells YouTube this content matters and helps us reach more people who need to hear stories about resilience and justice. Drop a comment and tell me, what would you have done in Sarah's situation? Would you have stayed hidden or confronted your betrayer publicly? I read every single comment and love hearing your thoughts. And if you're new here, welcome to our community of story lovers who believe that truth is stranger than fiction and justice always finds a way. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell because we've got more incredible true stories coming your way every week. Finally, share this with someone who needs to hear that survival is possible, that justice exists, and that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to stay down when someone tries to destroy you. Remember, you're stronger than you think, braver than you feel, and more powerful than anyone who tries to diminish you. Until next time, keep believing in the power of the human spirit.